Welcome back to the new FITSNews studios, another edition of your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, founding editor of FITSNews.com. We have got a lot to cover this week. As we do every week, I'm going to sit down with Jen Wood to do a blow-by-blow update on the latest in the Murdock murder saga. Again, in the aftermath of that big jury tampering reveal a few weeks ago, this story has gotten fresh legs. It is back with a vengeance. Jen Wood and I are going to go through all of the details of the Murdock saga this week. We're also going to talk about some resolution in a case that we've been covering for several years now, the tragic boating under the influence death of Stan Kiser. He was killed on Lake Murray back in 2019 by a boater who was allegedly impaired. There was a verdict in that case on the criminal allegations against the individual responsible for Stan Kiser's death. We're going to update you on all that. Last but not least, we're going to talk geopolitics. There was a major geopolitical incident that occurred right here in South Carolina involving an F-35 fighter. Now that generated international attention, but we're going to tell you the real story behind that crash and why you should be concerned if you're an American citizen and taxpayer. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So we're starting this week where we have seemed to start ever since the bombshell revelations earlier this month, the Murdock murders, crime, and corruption saga, as I noted, back with a vengeance. The jury tampering allegations raised by Alec Murdock's attorneys have been dominating the discussion for the past few weeks. But this past week, the saga settled into several other areas. There was a federal plea deal for Alec Murdock, which has raised a ton of questions about the ongoing battle between state and federal prosecutors. And I believe arguably the biggest news of the week, the dropping of the new Netflix documentary, the second season of Murdock Murders, A Southern Scandal, which dove into some pretty compelling stuff we've been reporting, again, for going on 2 years now. But I'm here. We're going to do this segment. Jen Wood, you are the Murdock encyclopedia, Jen. And I say that's got to be a blessing and a curse these days. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. Every time I think we're going to move on to another story, that just pops back up again.
They pull you back in. But a lot to unpack here, Jen. Why don't we start with this documentary? You wrote the article for FITSNews.com about this second installment of the Netflix documentary. What were the things that really stood out to you as you binged that when it came out earlier this week?
I was really, I've watched every one of the documentaries that's come out since the Murdock became a household name. I was really impressed by this season. I sat through the 6 weeks of the trial, and I've, rewatched a lot of the footage since then just for, purposes of writing stories. But it was kind of like watching the trial again, the way they edited it in with interviews with key participants. I was very impressed. They had some very interesting interviews. So it was the first time that we've heard from cousin Eddie, which we all know I was excited to hear from, and Blanca, the housekeeper for the Murdocks, and Shelley Smith as well. So yeah, I thought the interviews they got were amazing. Eddie did not disappoint.
Well, let's talk about Eddie for a minute, because we're talking about how they interplayed this with the trial, and they were advancing the narrative through the trial testimony. But as we recall, despite much anticipation, a huge crowd gathering multiple days to catch a glimpse of Eddie Smith, he was never called to the stand. This was really his first testimony.
Right. And he went through his version of what happened during the roadside shooting for the first time with cameras rolling. And, according to his version, it aligns with what we had been told from our sources, that when Alex pulled up and asked him to shoot him, he admitted to it. He said, well, why would you want me to do that? And it got all fucked up.
Yeah, that is what he said.
Yeah, and he said that, he shot his gun off in the air. He said Alex fell, and the wound you saw on the back of his head was actually from the blacktop on the road.
Interesting. So not a gunshot wound.
Not a gunshot wound.
Wow. Yeah, that roadside shooting, again, for those of you who are catching up with this story, it was in September of 2021. about 3 months after the double homicide that really propelled this case to an international audience. But Jen, it was that roadside shooting when this shifted from a murder mystery into this massive, you
Right.
know,
Like, what
this
is happening?
right. Everybody at that roadside shooting. I remember watching all of the metrics on this story, just the viewer engagement. They just went off the charts, and also I think that was the first time when people started. Well, let me rephrase that. When people stopped taking the Murdoch's word for everything down
Right.
there in the South Carolina Low Country. That was the incident that very quickly, that story, Alec Murdock claimed that a passerby who was helping him with a flat tire shot him. Well, we found out very quickly he had run flat tires on the car. They lied about which hospital he was sent to. Everything about that story collapsed instantaneously. And of course, the collapse of that narrative helped the unraveling of his story about the murders, didn't it?
Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, I think the roadside shooting is where this story went from, just a homicide story to like, to what it is today. It's just, you cannot believe the twists and turns that come with this story.
Well, I also want to it seems like we're going back to 2020 a lot in this
Hmm.
episode, and that's a good thing because I now want to take you back to 2021 when Murdoch's own attorney, Dick Harpootlian, referred to everything happening around his client as an Ozark situation. And Cousin Eddie in this Netflix documentary had a few things to say that dive back into that, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Eddie, I'm still not sure. Eddie was very likable. I am inclined to believe a lot of what he says, but I don't know what the truth is. I don't know, what's fact or fiction in this case. But when he started talking about his work as an errand boy for Alex, that was when it got really interesting. So he said in early 2015 or 2000 and late 2015, early 2016, he was at Alex's office and Alex asked him to run an envelope to Beaufort for him, paid him $200. So he agreed, put the envelope in his car. He said when he threw it down, he heard pills rattling in it. And he said he didn't look at the name, just assumed he was delivering an envelope to a law office in Beaufort. Then he went on to say that after that, Alex had him driving to small airports across South Carolina and Georgia to meet people. He did not expound on that. That was kind of where he left it, but I was like,
Wow. And speaking of not expounding, this latest installment of the Netflix documentary ended with a cliffhanger. They were asking the housekeeper, Ms. Simpson, whether or not she felt Alec Murdoch acted alone. And she had an interesting answer, didn't she, Jen?
she started, I mean, the way she answered it, she said, I'm not comfortable answering that question. And I mean, there's a lot of pauses while she thought about it, and she had a look of pure fear in her eyes. So she did not answer yes or no, but the fact that she was afraid to answer certainly speaks volumes. And I also noted that they asked Anthony Cook that and Morgan Doty the same question, and the people closest to him all said that they didn't believe he acted alone. So whether or not it was acting alone in the actual murders or acting alone in the aftermath of disposing of, evidence, clothing, guns, helping, craft his alibi, I'm not sure, but I thought it was interesting.
Well, as we've said all along and pointed out all along, particularly during the 6 weeks when we were down in Walterboro covering this trial, it was a circumstantial case. There were
Hmm.
no guns. The guns have still not been found. So you're dealing with circumstantial evidence. Again, compelling, very
Hmm.
compelling. And you're also obviously dealing with a defendant who was clearly dishonest about where he was in the minutes, not hours, the minutes leading up to those horrific slayings there on the Mizell property back on June 7, 2021. But Jen, you brought up a good point there. You've got obviously in a murder, you've got the premeditation and the planning, you've got the act itself, and then you've got what was clearly an attempted cover up by Alec Murdock. And from where you sit, Jen, let me ask you this. Each one of those things, premeditation, the act, and the cover-up, do you think he had help? Walk me through each one and tell me whether you think he had help in each one of those facets.
It's interesting because there were two weapons utilized, which has always thrown people for a loop. And I think the prosecutors theorized that was to throw people off. But if it was planned, Dr. Kinsey also noted that it was a very messy, uncontrolled crime scene. So, I go back and think, well, if it's messy and uncontrolled, how premeditated was it? So I go back and forth on that. I do think the timing absolutely shows that Alex was at the kennels right around the time they were killed. It's hard to get past that in his action afterwards. But that was a messy crime scene. I mean, that was. I think the cleanup of that crime scene was a lot for one person to do in the amount of time that he had.
Mm-hmm.
So I struggle with that. I think he absolutely had help afterwards. Mm-hmm. Who would help him though? If somebody came to me and said, I just murdered my wife and son, will you help me clean it up? I'd be like, heck no. Like, no, get out of here. Like, are you kidding me?
I'm going to remember that, Jen. You're going to be my last call if I ever find myself in such a situation. But clearly this documentary raising a ton of questions, certainly tying a lot of details back together with the reporting that you were so instrumental in. That was one of the first projects we worked on with you, Jen, was trying to get to the bottom of those bigger drug allegations, not the local gang stuff, the cowboys, but was Alec Murdock involved in something deeper, something larger, a more sophisticated trafficking operation? And clearly the Netflix documentary now pointing some fingers, shining some light on the fact that maybe he was.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting to hear Eddie say, even though he didn't go into a lot of detail, the things he was saying they were aligning with what I had been finding.
Well, let's turn now, Jen, another big development as expected, as we reported, as multiple other outlets reported based on the documents released from the federal government. Murdock changed his plea in federal court this week from not guilty to guilty. And Jen, walk us through some of the particulars of this plea agreement that Alec Murdock reached with the feds.
So he was charged in a 22-count indictment on May 24th, 2023. It included conspiracy, wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and it was all based on all of these financial frauds that he perpetuated during, between September 2005 and October 2021. So the agreement says that he would spend 30 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He's also going to pay a fine of $1 million and forfeit no less than $9 million in assets. So in as part of the plea, he's agreed to cooperate in the federal investigation. Ongoing, sounds like. They've already charged Corey and Russell. So I'm wondering if, they are digging into those deeper drug connections at the federal level.
Yeah, obviously the federal cases in November of last year, Russell Laffitte, the chief executive of Palmetto State Bank down there in Hampton, South Carolina, found guilty of multiple financial crimes tied to these Murdock fleecings. And then Corey Fleming, the Beaufort, South Carolina attorney, he has pleaded guilty federally and been sentenced federally. He's also pleaded guilty and been sentenced at the state level, where Murdock and Laffitte are still facing charges. But this plea deal, Jen, a lot of the victims, their attorneys, not happy.
Yeah, part of the agreement, one of the only parts of the agreement that benefits Alex is that he's able to serve his federal sentence concurrently with any state sentences. And people are not happy with that arrangement.
Yeah, we spoke with several of the attorneys close to this and believe that they will be very vocal in their objection to this federal sentence. We also heard from a few of those lawyers who said they were a little disappointed that the state keeps them in the loop on this, asks for their input, their collaboration. In fact, a lot of these attorneys were the ones that brought some of these allegations to prosecutors in the first place. Didn't seem as though they were that pleased with how the feds looped them in on the process. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. But we've got still more Murdock stuff to cover, Jen. That wasn't the only thing that happened this week.
It just keeps coming. So we did obtain a interesting video that relates to the juror tampering allegations from Alex's attorney, Dick Harpootlian, and Jim Griffin. And the video certainly was interesting. They were going, they've been clearly knocking on doors throughout Colleton County to talk to people about what happened to get this woman, we call her the egg juror, dismissed. And somebody provided us with one of those conversations that they had with the employee of the tenant of the egg worker. We're going
6 degrees.
Yeah, 6 degrees of
here.
What the heck here. So the employee co-worker of the tenant of the egg worker, they interviewed her. She had sent an email to Judge Newman saying that the tenant had said that her landlord was delivering a refrigerator and had indicated she was on the jury and provided opinions on his guilt or innocence. So, trying to get to the bottom of how that happened, Dick Harpootlian was out speaking with this person, and there's a recording of it. I thought it was interesting.
Why don't let's cut real quick. We've got a clip of it here we're going to play real quick. This is attorney Dick Harpootlian interviewing the co-worker of the tenant of the egg juror, relaying those initial jury tampering allegations. Let's take a listen.
So, we're handling an appeal and we're trying to delve into everything. And you wrote an email to the judge,
yes,
right?
Sir.
Okay. And what we'd like to figure out is what happened to cause you to do that. You worked with right? And she said to you what?
She was talking about the trial, and she said that her landlord had came over and she had needed a refrigerator replacement. And her landlord came over and she was, telling her that she's a jury and that she thinks Alex is, not guilty or isn't guilty of it, and she did.
Or did she say that they hadn't proved him guilty?
She told me that she said that she thought Alex was not guilty.
Okay. And so...
And I felt, not even though that she's saying that, but even if she said, I feel Alex is guilty or isn't guilty, I feel as a juror, you wasn't supposed to be telling nobody you're a juror.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
and I'm just felt
we're not being critical of that.
Yeah.
So how did you come to write an email to the judge? Did you call somebody? You talk to somebody?
I talked to a friend of mine, and I told her what was going on. And she listened to her because she's my sister-in-law. Actually, we've been best friends for 20 plus years, though. And she told me that, the best thing to do is maybe look and see if you can get Judge Newman's email and maybe email him.
Did you ever talk to the court to court, Becky?
No, I did not.
Did you talk to any sweat agents? Anybody interview you?
No, nobody's talked to me.
So that email was just a result. You sent it. Nobody told you to send it. That was your idea to send it.
Yes, nobody's told me to send it. Nobody. I didn't even know. She just brought it up, and she said maybe he'll get it, maybe he won't. And, I just felt like.
Where'd you get the email from?
Off of Google. You can look it up. I can't remember how I found it, but I found it through Google. I typed his name in, and.
The only question I'd ask is, after you sent the email, did somebody contact you to find out who these people were, so they could go follow up with them?
No, nobody did.
So
I never once indicated who my where I worked. I never once indicated who she was, and I still got the email.
No, we have the email.
Yeah. I never once indicated, and then I think it was the day after that, or maybe the day, like 2 days after that, she told us at work that she wasn't going to be able to come because she had to go because of, how the
Did you ever tell her you were the one that...
I did not. I'm pretty sure she may know, but we never discussed it.
Okay, you still working at...
Yes, we're
You
both still working.
still her? See her? Okay. You got anything else?
Yeah, man, that's the only
Nobody
question.
responded to your email.
No one responded. No.
But the email didn't say... They said it was her tenant, but you never used her name. I've read it.
Yeah, I never used her name. I didn't want. I was trying not to bring her in it But if the judge wanted to ask me questions, I was just like, I would tell him if he asked.
Right.
So when I never got an email back, I was wondering the same thing, how they figured out who it was.
Yeah.
Because I didn't even know the jury number, the jury name. I just knew it was a jury.
Did you say you worked? I can't remember the email. In there?
I do
I
not
don't think so.
remember
I don't think
exactly.
so. What, you got it?
First, you have to make sure that's the actual email.
Yeah, it is. That's
Well,
the email.
that's
Yes.
No. So I wonder how they knew. Because she had the number of rental property.
Unless they knew, I don't know. The only thing I could think of is maybe they knew she had rental properties, and maybe she was the only one with rental properties. And unless they looked into them, I do not know. Nobody contacted him. I have no reason to
You know,
lie.
what we may want to do is get an affidavit from you that no one ever contacted you, was questioned you. Can you do that? We're going to be back here a week from Sunday. You be around?
Yeah, I'll be out.
Okay, all the affidavit is going to say is you sent this email and no one ever contacted you or questioned you about who it was or anything specific. Right? Okay, thank you.
So, Jen, you listen to that, and the first impression is, well, there's something here. There's something to these allegations against the egg juror. Was that your first thought?
Yeah, I really did. And, it also struck me that, in his line of questioning with this person, Dick Harpootlian was like, well, did you have any contact with Clerk of Court Becky Hill? And the juror said, no. Actually, nobody contacted me about it. She just sent the email and went on her merry way. So, yeah, it did give me some kind of, I kind of believed that maybe what had happened was not exact, was, the egg juror was dismissed appropriately. But then I had some questions about, just the whole thing's bizarre. So I don't know. I
Well,
did
and
have questions.
it is just one part of this broader picture here. I mean, we've got multiple allegations involving the removal of this juror that seemed crazy. There were the Facebook posts that we've gone into great detail on previous shows and on FITSNews.com, where there appears to have been a fabricated Facebook post that was placed in this local Walterboro group to throw some shade at the egg juror. So that was one of the reasons that she was allegedly removed. These comments made to a tenant were the other reasons. But none of this specifically addresses the tampering allegations against Becky Hill, because whatever you believe about why this juror was removed, whether it was justified or not, there are still allegations that Hill put her thumb on the scale with other jurors.
Right. So it's going to come down to the credibility. It sounds like the majority of the jurors have gotten representation. But I think Eric Bland's representing some. I think Mark Tinsley. I definitely know Eric Bland is Justin Bamberg. So they have legal representation. And to me, based on, interviews I'm hearing from them, the jurors that they're representing don't necessarily have the same story. So it comes down to, do you believe one or two jurors who say one thing? There's going to be hearing. There's going to be an evidentiary hearing in the end. Whether or not, who presides over it, that's a question. And whether or not these allegations have any credence to them is another question.
Well, the ball is in the court of the South Carolina Court of Appeals right now. They will decide, pretty easily decision, I think, which will be more than likely to send this case back to Clifton Newman to decide whether or not the jury tampering allegations have sufficient weight, sufficient merit, sufficient basis in evidence to order a new trial for Alec Murdock. And Jen Wood, obviously, the defense attorneys have made it pretty clear, Judge Newman, hey, you might be a witness to some of these allegations. So it'll be very interesting to see how they handle that as this thing moves forward. But more than likely, we are headed toward the appeals court sending this back to Judge Newman probably within the next few weeks. Certainly, we expect that to happen. FITSNews, that we've been at the very tip of the spear on all these cases, the crimes, the investigations, the accountability. Jen Wood, once again, you have been central to those efforts. Absolutely indispensable. The Murdock Encyclopedia, and can we count on you next week when all this stuff flares up again to dig into?
Oh yeah.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Jen Wood, thank you. Anything else on the Murdock front that we missed this week?
Oh, I'm sure we missed plenty, but there's only so much time. But thanks for having me. This was fun.
Absolutely. Jen Wood, our Murdock expert here at FITSNews.com. She's been at the heart of so much of our reporting on this. We will keep you tuned on the very latest as this crime and corruption saga rolls on. Shortly before 9 p.m., on the evening of September 21, 2019, which we're told was one of the darkest nights in the history of Lake Murray, a pontoon boat driven by Stan Kiser with his family, his wife Shawn Kiser, his daughter Morgan Kiser, was headed home near Susie Ebert Island on Lake Murray, just northwest of Columbia, South Carolina. At that time, a Baja or cigarette boat driven by Tracy Gordon, then 53 years old, of Elgin, South Carolina, slammed into the pontoon boat. The propellers from the cigarette boat did catastrophic damage. Stan Kiser's body was literally shredded. His wife Shawn lost her leg. Only Morgan, their daughter, escaped the crash without serious injuries. Last spring, we sat down with the Kiser family. This is Morgan Kiser recalling the moment that the boats collided.
We were almost home. You could basically see our house, so close, less than a minute's drive, and all of a sudden, it just sounded like metal, like you were in like a car, a car being crushed, a metal car being crushed. And they didn't know if you were going to survive or not. It felt like an eternity underneath that metal, that loud metal. And when I stood up, I just figured my father would be really upset because his brand new boat had been ruined. And I called out and I said, "Is everyone okay?" And my mom said, "Yes, she's fine." And I looked over at my father, and the guilt that comes along with not being able to save him is a lot to deal with. I'm really glad my mom's here, though, so. To have to choose between your parents is really tough. I stood up and I looked at my father. He was hanging over the side of the boat. His bone was out of his shoulder all the way up to his ear. And his body was just, I don't know where the rest of his body was. So I went over to try to save him, but then I looked at my mom, and her leg was just, I mean, you could see the bone and then muscle and just like gore. So I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? You know, I've only got like 30 seconds to save them. I've got to save both of them. I can't go home without my parents, right? So I've got to save both of them. This is my responsibility. So I just took my dress off immediately, just took my clothes off and tied it around my mom's leg as tight as I could. But I didn't think that was going to do anything. I didn't think that she was actually going to be saved because, I mean, her leg was destroyed. But I was like, okay, so I'm just going to do this really quick, and then I'm going to go back to my father, and I'm going to resuscitate him. And once I resuscitate him, then I can deal with both of them. But I went over to him, and his bone was out of his body, and his side was gone. And I picked up his head. I picked up his head to try to resuscitate him. And there was a little hole in his cheek. And I thought, I'll plug that and I'll just resuscitate him. He'll be fine. Once we get him to the doctor, he'll be fine. But I couldn't find his feet, you know, I couldn't find his legs. I didn't know where he was, and I didn't want to pull him down and snap his neck, and it'd be my fault that he was completely dead. If his neck was snapped, he definitely would be dead. So I I held his neck so it wouldn't be obstructed. And I wrapped him up. And I tried to hold his guts into his body. You don't ever think that something like this could happen to you.
So in the aftermath of this horrific fatal collision, a number of things happened. First and foremost, on the criminal side of things, charges were immediately filed against Tracy Gordon. He was hit with a reckless homicide by operating a watercraft charged with felony boating under the influence resulting in death and a felony boating under the influence resulting in great bodily injury for the severe injuries that Sean Kiser suffered in that crash. But it wasn't just the criminal trial. There was a huge civil complaint targeting the establishments that served alcohol to Gordon in the hours leading up to the crash. But bigger than that, Morgan Kiser turned this personal tragedy, this family tragedy, this horrific incident into a raison d'etre, into a cause for which she has spent the last 4 years of her life fighting. Morgan has become arguably the most effective boater safety advocate South Carolina has ever seen. And in fact, her efforts just this past June were successful in adopting new boater safety legislation in the Palmetto State. Now, that law, which was signed into law by Governor Henry McMaster this June, will require new boat owners to pass basic safety education prior to getting their boating license. So a big victory for those who want to make our waterways safer. And again, South Carolina, for those of you unfamiliar, this is a state 187 miles of coastline, lakes, rivers. It's a state where boating is a huge part of the culture, a huge part of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's lives. So this is a big deal. It impacts a lot of people. But as Morgan Kiser's legislative efforts encountered success, the legal case, the criminal case, continued to drag out. There were some settlements civilly. Some of the folks who were involved in serving Mr. Gordon in the hours leading up to this crash, they settled. So some of those cases were resolved. But the criminal case finally landed on the docket this month. 4 years, almost to the day, that this fatal crash took place. Now, I spent a bunch of time at the Richland County Courthouse over the past 2 weeks, watching some of the key testimony in this case and watching the verdict that was handed down at the end of those proceedings. Now, I wanted to just real quickly touch on a few of these things because this was a court case that involved some of the most prominent attorneys in South Carolina. Jack Swerling, if you recall our coverage of the Greg Leon murder trial, Jack Swerling was one of the lawyers representing Tracy Gordon. So was Joe McCullough, who, if you followed the Murdock murders, crime, and corruption saga, you know Joe McCullough. He turns up pretty much everywhere in that story. But these are two incredibly adept lawyers, and they scored a big, controversial victory in this case because one of the key pieces of evidence against Tracy Gordon related directly to his inebriation was a blood draw that was performed about 7 hours after the incident. Now, this draw was authorized by a magistrate. It was obtained by the Department of Natural Resources, which has, again, lead authority on boating accidents. But the blood draw was missing a signature on the affidavit, the probable cause affidavit. And so Joe McCullough, the attorney for Mr. Gordon, was successful in getting this tossed. Now, this was a huge decision. In fact, many believed it was going to sink this case. And let me tell you how close it came. Before the verdict was reached in this case, the alternate jurors were dismissed from service. I sat with a few of them after they were dismissed to talk about what they knew about the case, what they didn't know. None of them knew blood had been drawn, number one. Number two, none of them knew what the results were. And when I shared with them that Mr. Gordon had blood drawn, and that his blood alcohol content was 0.04, 7 hours after the crash, which you do the math on that, you back that up, that's over the limit at the time of the crash, for sure. And you could see it on their faces. You could see their jaws drop, their facial expressions change. And one of them point blank said, "That would have put me over the edge." In other words, that would have been enough to find him guilty on those BUI charges. But I was in the courtroom when those verdicts were handed down, and the first two you could feel the victims losing hope as those first verdicts were read. BUI resulting in death, not guilty. BUI resulting in great bodily injury, not guilty. You could hear the tears. You could hear some of the audible gasps coming from family members and friends of the Kiser family. They'd waited 4 years for this. 4 years, and on a technicality, it seemed all hope was lost. But the last charge, the reckless homicide by operation of a watercraft charge, when that was read, guilty. The jury found Gordon guilty of that last charge. Now, the sentencing related to these charges, again, for BUI resulting in death, that's a 25-year maximum sentence. So the reckless homicide by watercraft is much lower. It's 10 years. And so a lot of folks were expecting Judge Taylor, who was very friendly to the defense during this case, not only in that ruling regarding the admissibility of the blood alcohol content data, but very friendly to the defense in several rulings in this case. But when the time came to issue the sentence, to his credit, Judge Heath Taylor handed down the maximum. And in sentencing Gordon, he said, it's a blessing and a curse that I was your judge here. It's a blessing for you because I know the law and I made these decisions on admissibility. But it's a curse because I am now going to sentence you to the maximum because I believe you were inebriated that night. I believe you were impaired that night. So 10 years. Now again, Tracy Gordon probably won't serve all of that. But for those of us who follow this justice system here in South Carolina, I use my air quotes again here, where far too often lenient sentences are handed down for horrific crimes. And again, this is not a career criminal here. Tracy Gordon had never been in trouble before. This was not a deliberate, no one thinks this man deliberately did this. But on the stand, he did not come across as remorseful. He testified about the aftermath of the crash where he and his wife did not go back to the scene, despite hearing the cries of Morgan Kiser and her mother in the water. They didn't go back. Claimed he didn't want to add to the chaos. I don't buy that for a second. Not a good witness. But there was accountability in this case. I believe that sentence was justified, and I want to credit Judge Taylor. I disagreed with him strongly on his ruling on the admissibility of the blood alcohol and said so. And this is a news outlet. We've criticized him in the past for leniency. Of course, we've also praised him when he's gotten it right. There was a sentence in Richland County a few months ago where he did dole out another maximum sentence. But these are the kinds of sentences that we need to insist upon. This shouldn't be cause for celebration, folks. This should be the way it is. You kill somebody through gross negligence while impaired, there are consequences. But in South Carolina, too often, those consequences are lost in our system. Again, usually it's violent criminals, but in this case, it was just a gentleman who was grossly negligent. But again, in this case, we're going to give credit where it's due. Judge Taylor, after making what I believe was an error that could have cost this family the justice that it was owed, he did right when it came time to sentencing and threw the book at Tracy Gordon on this reckless homicide charge. But whatever the case, I want you to know you can count on this news outlet not only to bring you the truth about what happened, the firsthand accounts from those involved, but also to insist at every stage of the process on accountability from our justice system. That's been true in the Murdock case. It's been true in the Rose Petal murder that we followed. And it's true in this horrific boating under the influence crash. Count on FITSNews to always not only tell you the truth about what we know, but to hold the system accountable. So for many years, this news outlet has adopted a dim view on American imperialism or neoconservatism or global warmongering, basically America picking fights around the world in places that simply aren't core strategic areas or areas of pressing national concern. Now, am I saying America shouldn't have the biggest military in the world? Absolutely not. We should. We should have the most advanced, largest, most destructive, lethal military ever. Because again, that's how we're going to protect ourselves in this crazy 21st century world in which we're living. But again, provoking needless conflicts, that's where I draw the line. And if you read this news outlet, you've followed our coverage of Ukraine, you know, again, we've taken a very dim, critical view of needless engagement abroad. We've also taken a dim view of Americans subsidizing the defense of other countries. That's their job. Again, absent a compelling national security interest or core national interest, we shouldn't go in other people's backyards and pick fights. I'm talking about the South China Sea. I'm talking about Eastern Europe. Again, can't afford it. National debt went over $33 trillion this week, people. We got to take care of the problems in our backyard. And how can you go fight a war in Ukraine and fight and provoke a fight in the South China Sea when you can't even secure your own southern border? We've been to that border. We've seen literally the holes in that border. Fix that first, and then fix the problems within this country. Again, before you go air gunning money in a new Cold War, whether in, again, the South China Sea or Eastern Europe or the Middle East. But against that backdrop, we've obviously called out America's military-industrial complex. And against that backdrop, even if you want to talk about core national objectives, we have insisted on accountability for the weapons programs that our government runs. Because again, whatever your goal is with these weapon systems, they should be, again, funded transparently. They should be funded efficiently. We should manage our money well. But the F-35 program, the next generation fighter program replacing the F-A-18s, the F-14s, if you watch Top Gun as a child of the 80s, you know the planes I'm talking about. Those days are done. We've got these new next generation stealth fighters, the F-35s, and our news outlets covered them for a long time because when they first came out, a lot of them were slated for deployment here in South Carolina at Marine Corps Air Station in Beaufort. It's one of their home bases. But these planes from the very beginning have been just mired with all sorts of problems. The mechanics, the maneuverability, on every level, our planes just weren't stacking up. But there were other problems. It was not just the fact that these jets that we were making weren't up to the global challenges that they'll be facing in these hot spots where we continue to pick fights. Because here's the key. If you're going to pick those fights, at least have the better weapons, right? If you're going to pick those fights, at least have the technology. But we don't. We don't. We're falling behind in that war. And we saw it this week. A very highly publicized incident. An F-35 flying over South Carolina, coming out of Cherry Point Marine Corps Air Station up in North Carolina, went missing. That's right. Disappeared. This happened on a Sunday. The world found out about it the next day. And again, I think Nancy May said it best. How in the hell do you lose an F-35? This is a $100 million piece of equipment, part of a $1.5 trillion program, which, by the way, is more than 4 times what it was originally projected to cost. How do you lose a plane like that? Well, it was eventually found, crashed in Williamsburg County, South Carolina. Pilot did eject, was found in North Charleston, hospitalized, but pilot's going to be okay. But the reports of this plane crash have sparked all sorts of conspiracy theories, and I want to just a quick word here. Conspiracy theories, it's easy to dismiss them, but the problem in a world where the mainstream media and social media, corporate media, where they're all censored by government, where they're taking their orders from the Biden administration or whoever's in the White House at the time, there's a reason conspiracy theories gain traction. It's because you can't trust the real news anymore. But conspiracy theories about this jet have been off the chart. The first and the big one was that the Chinese government hacked the plane and flew it to Cuba, where they're going to apparently conduct experiments on it. But the other conspiracy theories are a little more troubling. A few eyewitness reports, which have just started to sprinkle through the mainstream, including a Fox News report, talk about people seeing this plane flying inverted with the canopy still attached prior to it crashing. That sounds like another Maverick Top Gun reference. You're right. The old inversion salute from that movie. But how does that happen? Again, if a pilot's ejected, landed somewhat safely, how does a plane fly inverted with the canopy still attached? I don't understand it. So again, conspiracy theories all over the map and the total secrecy. And again, I understand the need to protect military secrets. I get that. I'm not disputing that. But basic information. Nancy Mace, again, in calling out the armed forces on this, said, look, give us basic information about what happened here. We're not asking you to reveal the hidden secret technology. We just want basic information. But this F-35 drama, obviously researched it. We did a big story on FITSNews, 1-800-LOST JET. I thought that was one of my better headlines personally. But did a big story on FITSNews. And as I researched that story, because I always try to go a little deeper, I try to tell you a little bit more than just the surface of what's happening. And I try to also link to stories that I believe are relevant related to this program. And boy, did we find more than our fair share of those stories. Just this month, there was a big article in one of these trade publications which tracks all these military software and weapons programs. I said software there because this is critical. And I want to point this out because a lot of times you hear reports from generals and you see generals saying different things, and usually it's all very scripted, it's all very positive, it's all very propaganda-ish. I mean, of course they're generals, they're going to propagandize. But this one general, and I found this, his name's Mark Kelly. He is the leader of U.S. Air Command, so a guy who obviously is in a position of authority and knows what he's talking about. But I wanted to pull these quotes up because there's apparently a major issue with the software packages in the F-35s. And by the way, I also want to point out the F-35s were grounded for 2 days following this crash, this mystery missing mishap, according to the Marine Air Corps Division. All those planes were grounded for 2 days. But as we researched this, we found that there's currently a major issue with the production of these planes regarding the technological package that's attached to them. And this is not the stealth stuff, but this is the electromagnetic warfare. This is the jamming, the signals. This is the attempt by other governments to, like some of these conspiracy theorists have said, hack the plane or shut the plane's capabilities down. And there are key upgrades. And I want to read this real quick because we're talking about a third generation tech package that has not been installed yet on a lot of these F-35s. And so the U.S. Armed Forces are actually ordering the bare minimum of these jets because they know that the ones being produced now don't have the tech package they need, which has created serious problems in the South China Sea, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, because the jets we're putting into the field simply aren't up to the tech capabilities of their rivals. And I wanted to read this because this is pretty scary when a general goes on the record and says this. This is General Kelly, the chief of the Air Command. He said, "It's frankly, check your pockets. See what you have in your pocket." Talking about the jets that are available. He said, "Getting these jets on time and fielded is absolutely critical to our ability to meet global demand on a day-to-day basis." And if you read between the lines there, it's pretty obvious that we are not meeting that demand. And he talked about the new programming in these jets. He talked about how important it was and that until they get these upgrades, that they're not going to be able to handle crises around the globe. In fact, the general said, "I wish we had the ability, when a crisis pops up somewhere around the globe, to evaluate it and say, does this need the jets with the new tech packages, or can we use the old ones?" They can't even do that. And part of the reason is our production of these jets continues to be delayed. In fact, the latest round of jets now won't be delivered until the middle of next year. The latest delay from Lockheed, the producer of this aircraft. This is significant. And I want to also point out a couple reasons for the delays. The body frames for these jets, guess where they were made? Turkey. We're not dealing with Turkey anymore because they bought Russia's air defense system. So we shut down that production because we wanted to, again, pick a fight with Russia. Similarly, we shut down production of another component of this plane because they found a part that was made in China. Once again, conspiracy theorists all have a field day with that. But here's the bottom line. On both the technology and the production of these key military assets, America is falling behind. And we are falling behind at a time when a lot of our politicians, Nikki Haley, Lindsey Graham, are rattling sabers, calling China the evil empire, threatening to arm Taiwan. Also, Nikki Haley's husband's company can make millions of dollars sending military vehicles to Taiwan. Self-interest, political interest. These politicians are writing checks with their mouths that the American military can't cash. For no other reason, this program is hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Now lagging in production, lagging in technological superiority. Why are we picking fights in these circumstances? Again, the F-35 crashing in South Carolina was a big deal. And it should have been covered the way all the national and local media outlets covered it. But the bigger deal, people, is the reality behind the crash. The fact that, again, our military is falling behind at a time when our politicians are picking fights that we are increasingly going to be unable to win. America has an obligation around the world. I do not dispute that. But first and foremost, America has an obligation to protect its own borders and its own citizens. And until we can do that, and until we can create weapons programs that operate transparently, that operate with maximum efficiency, that are technologically sound, and until we can identify those global needs and apply those assets rationally, we're going to continue to erode from our status as what we once were just a few decades ago, the world's lone superpower. Well, guess what? We're not anymore, and it's screw-ups like this that are the reason why. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Again, I'm Will Folks, the founding editor of FITSNews. Got a lot happening next week, but one of the big things that's happening, can't wait to share this with you on Monday. The newest member of the FITSNews team is coming on board. We can't wait to introduce you to him. But I also can't wait for what's coming with that announcement. Apparently a major battle with one of the corporate media outlets here in South Carolina. You know, who knew? These outlets have spent the last few years calling me a blog, kind of dismissing what we do. Oh, he's a political blogger. Well, apparently now they're viewing us as competition. Who knew? Who knew, right? Apparently we are big broadcast badasses now, worthy of legal threats and attacks through big shot out-of-state corporate lawyers with deep pockets. But guess what? I don't think these people understand kind of how I roll. I like a fight. Depositions actually get me pretty excited in ways that probably shouldn't talk about on camera, but I enjoy those battles. And so to the media outlet that's been threatening FITSNews for the past week, guess what, folks? We're looking forward to getting to know you a lot better over the next couple months and years as this fight unfolds. And I hope your lawyers are just as excited about this fight as ours are. In fact, I got a text from one of the attorneys today saying they were itching for this scrape. So we look forward to it because here at FITSNews, we're not going to let the corporate media, which has been conveying Control-C, pablum, been clickbait garbage, poisoning the people of South Carolina with this pro-establishment nonsense. We are emerging because we are against that very approach to news. We have a principled, honest, blunt way of doing things. And guess what? If they didn't know about that already, they're going to find out as this fight unfolds. But again, keep it tuned to FITSNews as we not only bring on the newest member of our team, but we once again take a stand for doing news the right way here in South Carolina and beyond. We'll catch you on the next show, but thank you for your support. We're going to need it more than ever as we enter this next scrape in the battle for media, truth, accountability, and responsibility here at FITSNews.